and shall also be able to render English into Latin correctly. For the next class, the candidate must have thoroughly read the whole of Virgil, Cicero's select orations, and the Greek Testament, and have beside a general knowledge of arithmetic and English grammar. For the next, in addition to what has been mentioned, an acquaintance with geography, rhetoric, logic, and a general course of mathematics and natural philosophy will be required. It continues, after the present year, candidates for admission into the lowest class will be required to have read the 4 first books of Virgil's Aeneid, Cicero's 4 orations against Catiline, and the 4 evangelists in Greek. Requirement for admission into the higher classes will be proportionately increased. That these could be admission requirements for a charity school suggests that ambitious education was very widely available, and that the curriculum was still formed by Renaissance humanism, that is, by Calvinism. That is to say, learning as an instrument of power appears to have been very widely shared indeed. It is now common for people to know nothing about the supposed great figures of history, and this ignorance is often an odd sort of tribute. When I began re-educating myself after graduate school, I made a syllabus of the books I had always heard educated people refer to as if we all knew them. And I learned fairly quickly as I read them that even scholars in relevant fields had not read them. No one read Marx, for example, Marxists least of all. I learned that it was considered somehow both naive and pretentious to read him, let alone to form one's own opinion about him on the basis of reading. There was a full-fledged Marxist magisterium. There were interpreters of epic, not to say preposterous, authority. One was to become a proficient in their glosses and commentaries and not to distract oneself with the text, which, if one did take a glance at it, seemed in fact so extremely contrary in letter and spirit to all that was being said about it. Well, it is a tribute to their sincerity how wholeheartedly those wizard intellectuals took their own advice. I know it was in reverence to Marx that they lowered their gaze from the abscissimi verbi to the festschrifts and the quarterlies. So I know very well that the fact of not reading these writings which loom over history need not be taken to signify a lack of respect for them or even any indifference to them. The example of Marx and the Marxists is not even the most vivid instance of the tendency of people to feel deeply informed as to the essence of an unread text, and also liberated and instructed by it. Certainly that distinction belongs to the Bible. Both instances are germane to my subject. It is an important part of the scholarly folklore about the Puritans that they were agents of capitalist domination in America. This commonplace, which is reinforced by the non-reading or the inattentive reading of Max Weber's odd little work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, is repeated by Andrew Delbanco in the epilogue to the Puritan ordeal. Delbanco, speaking of the speeches at Gettysburg, says, Lincoln and Everett were on the same side of what was, some say, the military imposition of rule by industrial capitalist culture upon the last holdouts against modernity. So here we have an explicit and pejorative comparison with the South. It was, in fact, a view widely held among the Marxists that Marx would have favored the South over the North on just these grounds. But in fact, Marx wrote extensively about the American Civil War, and he was passionately and explicitly on the side of the North. He, being an economist, was aware that no one eats cotton, that cotton was valuable only as a raw material for manufacture, and that the economy of the South was purely the creature of industrial capitalism. That is why there was mass starvation in Manchester, England during the Civil War, and that is why England came near intervening on the side of the South, and why Marx was so delighted when it could not. As for the Bible, Insofar as it is associated with Calvinism and Puritanism, it is treated as a source of narrowness and severity. This is true especially in the matter of Mosaic law, which is in fact vastly milder than the laws of contemporary England and Europe, specifically as it affected the poor, who were the great majority of the English and European population. It is rarely the case that scholars who invoke Mosaic law as a synonym for severity show any signs of having read the few dozen relevant verses in the Pentateuch. Theodore Dwight Bozeman is an exception, but he seems to know very little about the workings of contemporary English law. So there is, in any case, implied comparison, and Moses is still assumed to be severe by the supposed but non-existent standards of British liberalism. This is a point to which I will return. I mentioned Max Weber. I know from experience that his book on this subject is assumed to have established certain things as true beyond all doubt. How odd a thing that is to believe about any book. Only consider, if one were to say to Weber, I have never noticed that Protestants work harder or attach more value to their work than people in general, he could reply, aha, you have proved my point. Because his thesis is that Calvinists, a small minority in Europe and often persecuted and deprived of civil rights such as property ownership, had filled the modern world with their odd and unlikable Geist. With the result that the whole of the modern world is now odd and unlikable. That is, his initial assumption is that Calvinists are not distinguishable in the ways he finds significant from anyone else. Then how can they be isolated as the source of modern angst? For, contrary to near universal belief, it is not capitalism itself Weber blames them for. He says that has existed from antiquity. He blames them for our discomfort with it. And might early 20th century Europeans have been uncomfortable with capitalism because it was unstable and rapacious, or because it employed workers, the majority of the population, at miserable wages and inhumane conditions from their childhoods? Well, by the time Weber writes, all that has been said to death. He has a more ingenious thesis. It goes like this. Calvinists had a particular desperate anxiety about the salvation of their souls. And though, says he, they did not remain religious, they were still driven by that self-same compulsion to achieve salvation by work and by visible prosperity. This latter, although according to him, their asceticism is a big part of what is unattractive about their Geist. How does he know that Calvinists feel a special anxiety about their salvation? We are to take that on faith, as it were. And how have they enlisted the whole Western world in this neurotic compulsion, which springs from an anxiety that is, for the thesis depends entirely on this, peculiarly theirs? I think if William of Ockham were here to apply his razor, we would find ourselves back at the earlier hypothesis. Was it poverty that drove people to endure killing labor, or was it the fact that they had somehow been infected by someone else's ethic? Weber says not one word about poverty or the working day or any other issue of social justice. I suspect that is why his thesis has never lost its appeal. If it is true, and this has been much challenged, that European Calvinists did at some point prosper relative to others, applying that razor again, why not take into account that they were the first to establish universal compulsory education for girls as well as for boys? While illiteracy remained the norm, that would have given them a significant advantage, not because they were striving to evade perdition or to appear to be an elect, but because the importance they attached to the reading of the Bible would have brought them the inevitable benefits of literacy. While many revered books and writers do go unread, there is a difference in the way Calvin is not read. He is not read with hostility and contempt. What is assumed to be known about him is scurrilous, yet to attempt to defend him is to render oneself suspect. I can tell you this on the basis of considerable personal experience. And this is true in a way and to a degree that makes me think it must be the stigma of heresy that hangs over Calvin. Of course, there are writers, Jacques Maritain, for example, who explicitly deplore Calvin and his tradition as a heresy that has contaminated history with demoniac rebellion against the right order of things. I doubt that most historians would be comfortable in the use of such language. Nevertheless, I find what seems to be, to the writer's minds, a virtuous ignorance of what the man taught and wrote. It is as if to assume the worst of him were right and creditable, and the careful avoidance of any direct encounter with his thought a proof of right-mindedness. In the Malleus Maleficarum, the medieval inquisitor's protocol for examining heretics and witches, it is specified that any advocate who makes too strong a defense of someone accused of heresy must himself be suspect of heresy. Perhaps there is a similar caution at the back of the minds of even potentially dispassionate historians where Calvin is concerned. If they seem to say anything positive about him, they might seem to be aligning themselves with whatever nameless evil it was that entered American history at Plymouth and has bedeviled us ever since. Without question, a polemical energy, the scholarly equivalent of throwing an inkwell at the devil, animates the work of writers who have every reason to be dispassionate on the subject. There is a heretical tradition with which Calvinism has been associated by its detractors. In the 12th and 13th centuries, there was a great civilization in southern France and northern Italy and Spain called Languedoc or Occitan. It was much influenced by the Cathar or Albigensian religious movement. In the course of two major crusades and an inquisition, the movement and much of the society in which it had flourished were exterminated, and the documents of Catharism were destroyed. The destruction was so thorough that very little evidence remains of what are said to have been its heretical teachings. It is known to have had no hierarchy and no church buildings, and to have had a wandering ascetic clergy, male and female indifferently, who preached from the Gospels, which were translated into the vernacular. Its adherents practiced perfect nonviolence, which extended to their refusing meat, milk, and eggs. How odd that it should be heretical to refuse meat and orthodox to kill people, but that is not our subject here. Those who found the Cathars heretical accused them, and this is their persisting historical reputation, of believing that the world was the creation of an evil God and was itself evil. They were and are said to have hated life in general, and in particular to have hated sexuality, this despite the fact that their clergy could be married women with children. This despite the fact that they flourished alongside and under the protection of the same culture that was producing the first great vernacular literature of Europe, the poetry of the troubadours and the courts of love. The reputation of Calvin and Calvinism bears a strong resemblance to that of the Cathars, as the Cathars does to the Manichaeans, the 4th century heretics denounced to such effect by Augustine himself. The most persistent aspersion against Calvinism and Puritanism is also that they taught an aversion to sex. In an extraordinary degree, considering the times and the ambient culture, this is absolutely not true of them. In his Sexual Revolution in Colonial America, Richard Godbeer makes it clear that their candid, even exuberant attitude to sexuality is readily documented. And so is their tendency to use imagery which the literalist is inclined to describe as sexual in their sermons and in their religious poetry. Of course, this is not a new insight. The Puritans were the farthest thing in the world from a secret society. Their passion for words, spoken, written, and printed was immense. But it seems that nothing can be learned from them which departs from the prejudice that controls the scholarly popular notion of their character and their influence. Godbeer himself tends rather to stare at language he would no doubt admire in Milton or Blake or Whitman, as if it were an enormous prolonged aberration on the part of the Puritans to express such feelings, rather than its being a tendentious error of scholarship to overlook and deny the fact that these were their feelings. While it is true they thought that sexuality should be expressed within marriage, the same is true of every religious community that has ever tipped its hat to the Ten Commandments. Again, there is implied comparison. If that Abrahamic tradition could be named, which has declared itself solidly neutral on the subject of adultery, then I could agree to finding the Calvinists exceptional in their disapproval of it. Again, this is a subject to which I will return when I address the larger subject of the role of Mosaic law in Calvinism and American Puritanism. For the moment, I wish simply to draw attention to the baseless and intractable legend of the Puritan repression of sexuality, which is associated with the legend that they hated the world. It is as if there were still, at the back of the Western cultural mind, the notion heretic, and certain ideas about what such a creature should be like. There is perhaps an equally atavistic fear of knowing more about them or thinking of them otherwise than as people it is good to hold in contempt. And since in this vacuum of knowledge anything at all can be said about Calvin and Calvinism, there are no bounds and no correctives. Once in the course of research, I looked up limbo in the Catholic Encyclopedia, and there, where I would never have thought to look for it, was a mention of Calvinism. The article talks about how the severity of Augustine's view that in limbo children who have died unbaptized share in the common positive misery of the damned, that's Augustine, gave way to Aquinas' gentler view that they live in a state of perfect natural happiness, though forever excluded from the vision of God. It says those who adhered to Augustine's view were commonly designated as by the opprobrious name of torturus infantium, torturers of children. And then it says, quote, at the Reformation, Protestants generally, but more especially the Calvinists, in reviving Augustinian teaching, added to its original harshness. One might conclude from this passage that Calvinists believed in the existence of such a thing as limbo. If the writer may be taken to imply that Calvinists believed in the damnation of unbaptized infants, then he is implying something absolutely opposite to Calvin's fervent teaching on the subject. Not only did he reject the notion that an unbaptized infant could be damned, he also taught that baptism is not necessary to salvation, which of course makes the whole issue moot. Calvin says, quote, God pronounces that he adopts our infants as his children before they are born, when he promises that he will be a God to us and to our seed after us. This promise includes their salvation, nor will any dare to offer such an insult to God as to deny the sufficiency of his promise to assure its own accomplishment. The mischievous consequences of that ill-stated notion that baptism is necessary to salvation are overlooked by people in general. For the reception of an opinion that all who happen to die without baptism are lost makes our condition worse than that of the ancient people, as though the grace of God were more restricted now than it was under the law. And he says, if the plenitude of life consists in the perfect knowledge of God, when some of them, whom death removes from the present in their earliest infancy, pass into eternal life, they are certainly admitted to the immediate contemplation of the presence of God. As the Lord therefore will illuminate them with the full splendor of his countenance in heaven, why may he not also, if such be his pleasure, irradiate them with some faint rays of it in the present life? This teaching of Calvin's is faithfully reflected in the Canons of Dort and the Westminster Confession. But to associate Calvin and Calvinism with the worst possible position that could be taken on any subject is simply routine. What exactly is it that is thought to have gone so epically wrong in Puritan America? The faith that there is a meaningful answer to that question has produced a scholarly industry devoted to filling in the blank. If they can be proved not to have been world-hating or sexually repressed, if it is discovered again that they did not dress in black, if their narrow biblicism proves on scrutiny to be Renaissance humanism applied to the texts and concepts, languages and history of classical and sacred antiquity, if their famous dogmatism dissolves under scrutiny into congregational autonomy and doctrinal debate, then the mystery of their pernicious influence is still to be solved. It is true that in the early colonial period, Baptists were driven out of Puritan Massachusetts, and it is also true that in the same period, Puritans were driven out of Anglican Virginia. Neither as Americans nor as Europeans were they exceptional in these matters. The fact that they had their wars with indigenous people, that in one episode they burned witches, that they practiced punishments which today strike us as bizarre, all these excesses and severities do nothing other than identify them as Europeans of the 17th century. Still, with a sufficiently thorough suppression of context, they are enough to tide us over, to keep us persuaded of their singular Puritan malevolence until the great question is answered, until the particular nature of that malevolence has been isolated and anatomized. What is the narrative that lies behind all this? That we could have gotten everything right in the beginning, and the society of our dreams, still unspecified, would have flowed from that first radiant historical moment? We certainly did not get that idea from the Puritans. The A in their alphabet was, be it remembered, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. Frankly, I think the idea that there is an Ariadne's thread that will lead us back to the moment in our history or our prehistory where crucial things went wrong is simply childish, no matter how many learned minds have put themselves to the problem. Mainly for the sake of argument, I have mentioned the South as a better candidate for the locus of our primal malfeasance than New England, but that again implies a comparison of the South with the rest of the world, which should be made explicitly if it is to be made at all. According to Pope Leo XIII, in 1888, 400,000 people each year were being taken out of Africa as slaves, in 1888. That is to say, from the end of the American Civil War until 1888, when objections began to be raised, about 10 million African people were carried into slavery in Latin America. American uniqueness is often derided when it has positive associations, when it makes of us, let us say, a city on a hill. Fine. But then simple consistency should deny us the inverse of that uniqueness, the negative exceptionalism, which is no more defensible nor in its way any less self-aggrandizing than its opposite. Slavery in America was simply one part of a global economics that flourished for years after we had withdrawn from it. It was the sin of the whole Western world. Now I will turn at last and briefly to the matter of the Puritan colonies' adoption of Mosaic law, which brought with it on paper the sentence of death for adultery and certain other offenses. I say on paper because Moses also specified that there could be no one found guilty of a capital crime without the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. As a consequence, the Puritans were very little inclined to apply these extreme penalties, as the Sanhedrin seems to have been on the same grounds. But in adopting what they called Moses his judicials, they incorporated a truly transformative vision of society. There is no reason to think they did not know exactly what they were doing. Thomas More, early in his Utopia, writes that though the laws of Moses are considered harsh, they are very mild in their punishment of property crimes. He says this in the course of describing the extreme cruelty of the English treatment of the poor, then being driven out of the countryside by the early clearances. The brutal treatment of the poor under British law, that is of laborers as well as paupers, was ancient and continuous. Their misery predisposed them to pitifully minor crimes for which they were indeed hanged. The theft of 5 pennies was a capital offense. English law was based on the good capitalist theory that the wages of labor should never rise above the level of subsistence. We tend to forget that it was the English who promulgated these laws. This one is called the iron law of wages, and it meant for most people, and under the best circumstances, mere survival. Any misfortune made them desperate. It was illegal to beg, and it was illegal for a private person to give to a beggar. Such overwhelming pressure toward theft was met with ferocious sanctions against it. And I do not wish to be guilty of seeming to imply comparison here. The poor were treated brutally everywhere in Europe. In any case, all this is utterly remote in spirit from the laws of Moses, as you will know if you have ever read them. Their economy is based on regular forgiveness of debt and provisions for the sustenance of the poor, sustenance which is theirs by right, given to them by God. Added to this are laws protecting the poor from injury, as well as the continuous urging of an ethic of generosity toward them. Not only do the laws of Moses deal mildly with theft, they also protect the poor from the need to steal, which is a vastly greater kindness. We know from the prophets that these laws were often ignored, and we know from them also that the wrath of God is brought down on peoples for abusing the poor far more frequently than for any other transgression. Calvin, in his sermon on the Eighth Commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," redefines theft itself in a manner consistent with Mosaic law. He says, "God does not judge thieves in the way men do. For those who enjoy reputation and influence will not fail to be condemned before God. Indeed, although none should accuse them, unless it is the poor who out of hunger cry for vengeance, although not a word be spoken, the afflictions that the poor endure speak loud and clear before God and lead to a trial without a word being spoken. Therefore, let us remember that whether by God or through the Holy Scripture, all forms of wrong are called stealing. And in fact, when God, through the prophet Isaiah, threatens that whoever has pillaged and ravished will experience the same, he is not talking about these little thieves who are led out to the gallows, but he is talking about the great princes and kings. Thus, thieves who are honorable here below will not be forgotten, but will be cursed by the law. Life was very difficult in early Massachusetts. What did they do with the poor among them, the old and the lame, the unwed mothers and their children? For a long time, they had a kind of foster system. They were placed in families, and the town paid their expenses. An official who did not see to the needs of an indigent person was fined 20 shillings. Now, for 17th century Europeans, that is all remarkably benign. There is a poem that, so far as I can discover, appeared in every edition of the New England Primer. It is the farewell to his wife and 9 children of the martyr John Rogers, always depicted at the stake wearing his Geneva collar and engulfed in flames. It says in part, "As you would that other men against you should proceed, do you the same to them again when they do stand in need. Impart your portion to the poor in money and in meat, and send the feeble, fainting soul of that which you do eat." There has never been a more passionate, thoroughgoing, and Mosaic sermon on the obligation to liberality than Jonathan Edwards' sermon on Christian charity, but of course it is never read. If these data seem a little fragmentary, it is understating the matter to say that there is no scholarship on the subject of Puritan benevolence. Calvin says, "Each man will so consider with himself that in all his greatness he is a debtor to his neighbors, and that he ought in exercising kindness toward them to set no other limit than the end of his resources. These, as widely as they are extended, ought to have their limits set according to the rule of love." And he says, "We ought to embrace the whole human race without exception in a single feeling of love. Here there is no distinction between barbarian and Greek, worthy and unworthy, friend and enemy, since all should be contemplated in God, not in themselves." The history of New England is complex, but it is out of the culture of New England that emerged the vast and forgotten utopian movement, as well as the great reforms, the abolition of slavery, public education, women's rights, public libraries, that has given this culture some right to call itself a democracy. What if these things were the political expression of a Calvinist rule of love? What if all along we have been obscuring from ourselves, with ignorance and ridicule and judgmentalism, an example of exceptional decency? A flawed example, as they really would be the first to insist, as they in fact did insist, but one we have needed, I think, and one we are perhaps poorer every day for the loss of. Thank you.
With a little bit of fear and trembling that I proceed to ask a question. I first of all want to say how privileged I think we are to have you in Iowa City. I know that I've enjoyed some of your classes and even in the Old Testament, and you've always been willing to share yourself and to answer questions. My concern is how Calvin and the churches that inherit this heritage, what it has to say today to our American situation. In other words, the relationship of Calvinism to the state, and whether there's still something going there that will have a redemptive effect upon our very confused society that is now at war.
Well, I think that, you know, there's a vast resource of wisdom in our culture, Calvin being one example of it, that unfortunately we don't consult, we don't read, we don't discuss. I think that we're, in a certain sense, losing the benefits of a civilization that is, in fact, very accessible to us. And I think, I mean, I really, you know, my message always is, go look at these things. There is so much to learn, you know. I mean, if we, for example, were to take on the implications of the, you know, the statement that I read last from Calvin, I think that that might perhaps make us more civilized people, you know. I think that there's a huge, huge failure on the part of the culture here that does inherit Calvinism, and it's a huge part of American Protestantism that actually is based on Calvin. They have been intimidated away from loyalty to their own best, you know, literature, their own best moments, their own values. And they have, in a way, surrendered the possibility of making an effective criticism of the society, which is all that any of these traditions, you know, it's the great obligation of all of them.
Marilynne, also add my thanks to you for this very, well, I would say erudite. I'm not sure how clear it is in my mind, but the lecture tonight was certainly stimulating. Question I have really follows on a question that Russ had, having to do with the relevance of Calvin's teaching and example and exercise of discipline within the consistory in Geneva to contemporary church life and perhaps cultural life generally. I wonder if you could respond to whether you think that his focus on discipline is relevant today.
I think that to a certain extent we're probably looking at the word discipline in ways that are not appropriate to a Genevan context. You know, I mean, Calvin was trying to define a religion and a society that had not existed on the face of the earth before, and therefore he had a kind of careful attention to things that have become customary for most of us. Things like, you know, for example, formalized, legalized marriage and so on. It's hard to know exactly what to base your impression of Calvin's Geneva on. I've read the first year